on the. All right. Hopefully, everybody remote can hear me, and we'll be able to hear Satra soon. It's a great pleasure, really, truly a great pleasure to welcome Satra at McGill for this talk. I don't know really how to well introduce Satra. Is the thing that is amazing me is that often people encounter Satra and then say, hey, you're also working on speech processing and things like that, because it's so well known for many of the open source tools that we are using in the neuroimaging community and beyond, actually. That he's also one of the first people who have pushed the hackathon and the open science aspect of in our field. And that in itself is is a life accomplishment. And so beyond that, he's also a neuroscientist that you will hear from in his own kind of a neuroscience aspect as well. But it's been a long journey with Satra and on the many projects that we're doing these days with the Repronym project especially, but working on the reproducibility of life sciences and neuroimaging in particular. I think that's it's really an honor to have you here and really a pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you.
I should say that Satra is both at MIT and Harvard Medical School and as a lot of
Thank you, JV. Thank you very much, and thank you, Selena and JV, for the invite over here. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As JB said, I kind of chose this topic because that's some of the scientific work we do in our lab. Most people kind of talk to me about neuroinformatics and infrastructure and open science, but I thought it would be an opportunity because many of you are grad students to kind of present work from a few grad students who've been in our group, and that covers some of the areas that I'm personally interested in terms of understanding. And this is really about this idea of a speech chain. So before I start, that's my group, and we kind of do all kinds of things. One part is to understand this neurophysiology of human communication. As a result of that, we want to use it for things like precision medicine and psychiatry. So we end up developing things like AI and ML tools around it. And then we realize we don't have enough data. So we do a whole lot of things to say, how do we get infrastructure and efficient processes to come in together to kind of span the set of things? And I will say, I also tend to say that we do a fourth thing in our group, which is social engineering, because a lot of these things often require interactions across people. So we spend a significant amount of time collaborating with folks at various places. So today I'm going to kind of talk about the speech chain, and I feel like when I talk about speech, I have to introduce it through two mandatory slides. So this is the first one of them, and I'm going to read it. Sound emerges from the windpipe and stirs the still air. Once aroused, the agitation spreads until the last wave of motion slackens, having attained its limit and been drawn out to its full extent. Air provides the substance and the instrument of speech, the form. From these two, sound derives the shape and essence of speech. For the tongue forges sounds to form an image of speech and serves as a hammer in the process. Shaped by its efforts, the articulated substance of speech travels to the open ears. Having first been admitted to the ear as though to the outer vestibule, the voice calls out and is admitted to the inner rooms. The ear keeps outside the rhythm and the resonance of the words, but the thought signified gains admittance. The ear interprets what comes from without, the tongue reveals what is within, and each requires the aid of the other. This is a translation from Latin. I don't speak Latin, so I was happy to see a translation from about the 12th century. So people have been understanding and delving into how things work for a long, long time. And this is not terribly far from our current understanding. I mean, they didn't know how the brain works around these things, but the general thought process that these things are connected systems come out. So today, with modern technology, we get to see a few things inside the head. So we can see an MRI scan of a person talking in real time. So we get to see this incredibly complex thing that we do. I tend to argue, and I'm biased, that this is the most complex motor action an average human carries out. We're not talking about the Roger Federers of the world. They carry out incredibly complicated things. But as an average human, most of us speak effortlessly. And it involves the utilization of 100+ muscles that integrates and makes us take our thoughts and put it out there so that people can hear. On the other side is an equally complex process that takes this pressure wave that's coming in and decomposes it to all the content, the emotion that we get to hear when somebody speaks. So to me, this is one of those most incredible things that we do. And it's a pleasure, at least personally, to study this and see how we can reach out beyond the neurophysiology into communication as humans. Some of the folks I know do work on interactions between humans and animals, and I'll present some of the work that some of these folks have been doing in our group. This is the second video, and for those who have seen it, I apologize. I hope it plays. Human communication. Now, if you ask me what they said to each other, I would tell you I have no idea, right? But they were intent on communicating with each other. And this is really this speech chain we're talking about. The fact that it's an interactive communication process. It involves us listening to ourselves speak, but it also involves communicating to others and their interactions with us. And that's what makes a model system in my mind, and one that we need to study humans to look at. I mean, we're looking at the linguistic level. Now, one might say there was no linguistic level in what we just heard, but I will never be able to tell you that right this minute. There may have been profound linguistics involved in that communication. There's a physiological level. We're using this physical apparatus to speak to each other. And hence, we can study it from a linguistic, a physical, physiological, and an acoustic level. And that's what makes a system fairly complex and interactive. Now, we can take this and break it up into signal processing. So maybe some of you have either backgrounds in biomedical engineering or signal processing. We can simply take the systems. The lungs produce power, right? Anybody who's a singer over here knows like exercises they've done to project their voice in various ways. The vocal folds produce some bit of that sound, but it's not vibrating by itself. We don't actually make our vocal folds vibrate like we control our arms. It's vibrated by a pressure difference between the lungs and the outside. So we close them and the pressure builds up. And as the pressure builds up, it builds up to a point where the vocal folds are forced to go apart and it releases it as puffs of air. It just does it at a high enough frequency to let us make the sound that we're hearing from here. But this is not the only source of sound. We also make sounds like sh, which are not at the vocal fold. They're produced further on in the mouth. And then the mouth itself and the nasal tract provides resonance chambers that accentuate the sound to produce the kinds of sounds you hear. So the difference, and you could all do this with me, even the people online if you want to. I won't hear you there, but if you say ah, okay, now keep that pitch, which is your vocal fold, intact, so the same. Say e, e. What did you just do? You moved your tongue to a different position, right? And that changed the sound that you're producing, and it made it different. And that's what we are doing. We just have kind of incorporated this as we have learned from a young age, and we don't think about this anymore. But that's what produces the content that comes out, the positioning of the tongue in various places to reshape the vocal fold to produce different types of dynamics of sound. Now we can take that simple waveform, right? At the end of the day, it's still a pressure waveform. When I'm speaking, it's sending out variations in pressure, and you're listening through your ears, those variations. It just happens to be something that seemingly simple, but conveys a lot of complexity in various ways. And because we've been studying speech, at least thinking about it for a few millennia, if not more, but at least studying it from an engineering perspective over, I would say, the last 80 to 90 years, we have a lot of different ways of looking at it. So we can look at it in the time domain, just the pressure fluctuations that results in this change in intensity. We can look at something called a spectrogram, which breaks it up into a time and frequency domain representation. And this was created during World War II. It was part of Army research process to encode sounds that it was picking up in different places. But it allows us to kind of look at shapes of changes dynamically. And as I give this as an exercise to my students, can you say what this was said? Now, I'm not asking anybody here to do that exercise, but it's this inverse process. We can infer from understanding the physics what their shape might have been as an approximate to what they were saying. We can look at resonances, which in the speech world we call formants, and we can track them over time. We can also look at them in the spectral domain as peaks of the spectra. And then we can look at pitch. That's a colloquial term for the vocal fold vibration frequency. What I do, I'm just changing the vibration characteristics over here, and we call that pitch. But we can then kind of move into a more linguistic space of starting to break apart words into pieces. So we do all of these things, and this can be done fairly easily today. We can also look at the brain. And I'll play this a couple of times. So this is a person in the scanner reading this passage. It's a classic passage that's used in speech research. I'll play it. And what we're seeing on the left is just dynamic fluctuations as they're reading the passage. So it's a robust enough signal that in real time, we can locate parts of the brain that are activated as part of doing this task in the scanner. Now, this doesn't mean that it captures all the dynamics that we're looking at. We're looking at an fMRI signal. It has its own challenges in terms of thinking about this, but it's something we can monitor. And this translates to a lot of real estate in the brain. When we're talking, when we're producing things, when we're reading things, we engage a lot of cognitive functions. And that's the other part of this speech chain. We're interacting with memory processes. We're interacting with motor processes. We're interacting with emotional processes. And that allows us to investigate various aspects of the brain through just studying and understanding speech. And over the years, people have built models. People have said, it's not just brain activation. I can look at what each part might be computationally doing. And that's, I think, important as we are thinking about any system. The ability to model it gives us a way of falsifying the model, gives us a way of saying this model does not fit certain types of observations. And this can explain a lot of things. I'll talk about a few that this cannot explain right now. So there needs to be evolution of this model as time goes on. At a basic level, I don't need you to know all the regions in the brain, just this idea of a feed-forward control system and a feedback control system. I'm speaking to you fairly rapidly, right? If I relied on feedback, it would slow me down. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to create this rapid process of talking. So there is a system, but I learned. As a kid, I learned how to produce speech. So something about that feedback was important. And as an adult, I can change my speech if the feedback is changed. And I'll talk about one of the things that we're doing in that space. So remember a feed-forward and a feedback control system. And more generally, you can simplify that whole model into something like this. There's the brain, a controller. There's the plants, the physical plants, our lungs, our vocal tract, things that are actually producing the sound. The output is speech, which comes out as pressure waves. And then there is auditory and somatosensory feedback. So we are hearing it through our ears. You are hearing it purely through acoustic input. You're not getting my somatosensory feedback. But when I'm sensing it internally, I'm also sensing the somatosensory part of this. So that was the shortest 12-minute primer on speech. And now I'm going to kind of move into 3 areas of projects that will cover various elements of the speech production system. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Mumble melody, and then I'm going to shift over to something we've been investigating in the context of voice and identity. I don't know if you do banking over here where it asks you for your voice as a way of getting entry. So there are questions around it. And then finally, I'm going to expand out of just the acoustic space a little bit to a broader communication space on looking at speech, language, and mental health. Now, I'm only going to highlight a couple of projects in this. Happy to chat with you about details of this and other projects in the next hour. Okay, so let's start with this. I think I mentioned that every project that I'm going to talk about started with a question. And in this particular case, the question is that we were interested in people who stutter, people who have difficulties producing certain kinds of sounds. And however, these people tend to not stutter when they're singing. When they're singing or speaking with others. So in a chorus, if you work with me and we read the same thing or say the same thing, they tend to reduce stuttering. Whispering reduces stuttering. Speaking with a metronome, a fixed temporal pattern, as if you're setting expectations. And then this idea of altered auditory feedback. If I take the voice, transform it in a certain way, and feed it back into the ear, it changes the dynamics of people who stutter, and they again reduce stuttering. Now, there's an opportunity in this because about 1% of the adult population stutters. Among children, it's significantly higher, but most children grow out of stuttering. The persistence is only about 1%. Till not too long back, that's the same percentage we would have considered for autism. Autism, the percentages have grown higher, but that's a large number of people. And we don't often encounter people in our daily lives who stutter because they often get towards jobs and other things that do not interact with places and people. So it creates economic changes or shifts given the communication. So it's very important to understand that we want to destigmatize stuttering, that they're as part of the world as any of us, and we should be, even without additional fluency, be able to talk to people who stutter and appreciate and understand that they may have difficulty communicating, but that's okay. However, it also provides us a way of investigating something that's going on in the brain. And it allows us a way of seeing how the brain reacts to changes we can make behaviorally on the outside. So what we built is a tool that is an iPhone app at the present moment. Anybody of you who has iPhones, and the second requirement is a wired headphone. We haven't solved the Bluetooth challenge, which I know is difficult at this point in time. Everybody has Bluetooth pods at this point. The latency, we need this feedback to be processed rapidly. So I'm going to play a little bit of this video.
Here's a quick demo of Mumble Melody. To use the app, all you have to do is wear headphones, plug in your headphones to your device. Select one of the 4 AAF modes on the app. Speak into your microphone. Our technology will alter your voice and then play it right back through your headphones while you are talking. You will hear it, but others around you won't. If you are speaking to someone on your device, the app will work in the background. You can use the app as you speak in everyday situations or to practice speaking on your own. Mumble Melody has a few different options for altered auditory feedback. The unaltered mode will play back the user's unaltered voice. The whisper mode will make the user's voice sound like a whisper. The reverb mode will play back an echo of the user's voice. The harmonized mode will introduce a musical effect to the user's voice. If you want to learn more about the study, visit our website at sensin.group/mumble.
So there's an App Store link. If you know people who might provide us feedback with, or you just want to play with it, feel free to. This will come up a little later again. So what can we do with it? Well, it provides a low cognitive load. It's an inexpensive solution. So this is developed by Rebecca as part of her PhD thesis. And one of the key elements of this is very easy to translate, right? The Bluetooth part, still not easy. We're working on it. But at an overall level, it's changing through some signal processing, the voice stream, and feeding it back into the ear. Now, this is what it sounds like for a person.
Had speech therapy since March. The person I'm working with is like she specializes in she specializes in stuttering.
As you can imagine, there's problems kind of communicating. Again, as humans, we should be acceptable of that process. But this is what this app can do, kind of plugging into this system.
The Notes app I use all the time because if I think of something, I'm going to forget it, so just write it down. Or like little things that I see that I want to look into later, I write it down.
So same session, same person. In this particular case, getting that transform feedback in their ear. So I'm just showing that as an illustration. This was the full experiment that was done with these people. So they went through different kinds of these transform modes because we wanted to understand how people were changing some of these things. I'm not going to stick on this slide for a long time, but each of these has certain kind of technical components of how you implement the transform, but also some perceptual components. You heard 3 of those in that earlier slide when it comes to how whispered voice sounds, how reverb sounds, and how harmony sounds. So we ran this on a bunch of subjects, and these are the results. So what we're seeing over here is the effect of raw voice, which is just listening back to your own sound without any transform. And that itself has some bit of an effect on the folks. But these were just stood out as very different in terms of their effects. So what this axis is showing is the person reduction in the number of disfluencies, or you can think of it as the person improvement in the set of disfluencies. So these particular modes allow us to kind of look at and investigate a very significant effect size when it comes to disfluent productions. Because we were comparing things within a person, we also had to dig up some fancy stats. It's called the harmonic mean p-value. Celine would probably know way more about this than I do, but it allows us to compare things and do a multiple comparison correction when things are interconnected and related to each other. Our standard Benjaminia or FDR wouldn't have worked in this particular case.
Did we in my class this morning? I was talking about Benjamin Hoffman. Oh well.
And while I'm not showing it here, there is no order effect, as in it's not just having this instrument. Each of these modes has a differential effect, which allows the possibility for personalization. Somebody could choose a different parameter setting and adjust it for themselves. So it allows for individualization of the system. So stepping back a little bit, how do we explain this? We can't. Our model does not allow us to explain this. This was the model we had of the system. And in that model, the general explanation was the following, which is if we provide delayed auditory feedback, it just is so disruptive to the system that you start ignoring out, you tune out your auditory feedback, and you say, I'm going to rely on that feed-forward control pathway. But some of these modes that seem to have a lot of effect are not that distracting. When we asked people who participated in this study, what did they think of these modes? They liked it. And so now the question is, if they like it, are they really tuning it out? And if they're not tuning it out, what aspects of the system are working together to do this? And I can tell you at this point, we don't know the answer. This is also where it makes the human system difficult to study. We can't really do these on mice. Now, some people are doing this on songbirds, looking at these feedback control systems and looking at things, but I would say the human is slightly different from songbird when it comes to this complexity of communication. So we have a long way to go, but we have some theories, and now we can say this does not work, and we can start looking at alternatives that might help us explain this. So I'm going to end this section with a few takeaways. We are fairly convinced that altered acoustic feedback has at least a strong short-term behavioral effect. One of the things we are doing with this study, if anybody is interested, is a longer-term study. How long does this effect last? In prior studies with just pitch shift and delays, the effect went away after 6 months. It's as if the brain realized what it was doing and said, I don't care about this anymore. And so we are interested in seeing if these other new modes of transform actually persist over a longer period of time, or the fact that they can select a mode and adjust it, the personalization that that provides helps adjust the system to other different individuals. Our current models cannot explain these effects. We can try, I can do ad hoc things, but they would be very ad hoc, speculative things as to how this model works. But it gives us a control or a model system. We have a person, we can induce a behavioral change, and now we can look at other aspects of this individual, whether through intracortical recordings, whether through fMRI or other things that look at and understand how this effect might be occurring. Okay, moving on to the second project. This literally came from our IRB. An IRB is an institutional review board. It's the ethics committee that tries to evaluate whether your experiment needs consent or not. We do voice experiments. And for a long time, voice was in this category of, it's not an identifiable thing. If I played you a random voice, not a famous personality, it would be very hard for you to know who that person is. The question then that comes up is it recoverable who that person is from some other source? And with TikTok, social media, and other things coming online, it has gotten into prominence that other people may be posting, I participated in an experiment at MIT today. And now it becomes a connected signal that I have to identify who the person is. So our IRB asked us, how identifiable is voice? They were like, you're the subject matter experts, come tell us. And so that has triggered kind of this realm of experimentation that asks us also to ask the question, how do we identify voices? Now, you're all listening to me, whether here or online. The people hearing online will probably hear a slightly different version of me because it's going through a microphone and going through some transforms over there. If I were to go away and you were to just hear my voice randomly out there, would you be able to identify it, etc.? So how do we identify voices? Does it play a role in our daily lives? If we knew a person's voice, does it make it easier for us to understand that person? And then another colleague of ours, actually Dave Kennedy, who's here, he and his colleague had a project where they wanted to play people's mothers' voices to babies and infants. And so he came up to us with a question and says, how do we tell two voices are similar? Now, people have been working on some of these questions for a long time. We just don't know the full answer to this because the technology space has evolved. It's much easier to do voice identification, voice recognition today than it was 10 years back. So this is an intersection of why that IRB question is important. Our technology is evolving. Our data sets, databases, the ways we do certain pieces are improving. So this is a project that Gasser, who's a master's student visiting a lab from EPFL, has taken on, and Fabio and Rahul are kind of helping out with some components of this. Fabio is a postdoc, Rahul is a grad student. So what does it mean to identify a voice? You could say discriminating between two speakers might be helpful. Recognizing the same speaker in different instances, even in your places where you live. The people you live with will have differences in their voice between when they wake up in the morning, at night, during the day, while they're eating their food and talking. They'll have some differences. we have seen this video of, it's a complicated thing. It produces sound, and then we identify on the other side who might be producing that sound. For people who are familiar to you, you can probably say, I know that the world of phone calls has changed. Most people do other things today. I have a kid, so phone calls never get picked up. But there was a time when we used to communicate over a very impoverished communication line. The copper line only has a bandwidth of 400 hertz to 4 kilohertz. And that was sufficient for most of my parents' generation and their parents' generation to communicate to other people. So voice perception relies on a fairly impoverished signal and can do it well. You could recognize who called you over a phone call. So let's do a little bit of an exercise. And for those online, I'm just going to pretend that you're doing this exercise. I'm going to play a couple of sounds, and I want you to keep them in mind and tell me if they were the same speaker or a different speaker. So I'm going to play the first pair.
Don't forget a jacket. Don't forget a jacket.
Okay, let's see. How many people think they were the same speakers? How many people think they were different speakers? So let's start with same. Okay, we have some difference of opinion. I'm going to take a non-response as acknowledgement of the other category, at least for today. I'll play now the next pair.
Maybe tomorrow it will be cold. Maybe tomorrow it will be cold.
Okay, how many people think they're the same speaker? Okay, so it's still a hard thing for us to do, right? Because there are variations, we get used to certain voices. If these were familiar to you, you would be in a very different space of doing this. And what this played with was this idea that there's speaker variability within the speaker, and then there's variability across the speaker. And that's what we are really trying to get at, telling people together versus telling people apart. And how do we get at the information space underlying this? And as I said, people have been looking at this for a while. So people have looked at various characteristics of within speaker variability, things that change our conversational speech. When I'm talking, I change the dynamics, I adjust what I'm doing. Child-directed speech, when mothers talk or parents talk to their kids, it's a very different kind of speaking that they do. It's called motherese in certain contexts. You overemphasize, over-articulate, you slow down, you put a lot of expressiveness in it. You might also think of speaking with background noise. All of you, or maybe not all of you, but many of you may have been in a bar. And as the number of people increases, your speech changes. You increase your loudness, you increase how you're communicating with people. So all of these have effects that are volitional. You kind of control some of these, but then there are involuntary changes that happen. Aging changes how we speak. Our emotional state changes how we speak. We change the dynamics of our intensity as well as our fundamental frequency. One of the things we are interested in is how different aspects of mental health changes how we speak. We can easily talk about slowing down, using content differently, but could acoustics actually get at it? And I'll talk about that in a little bit of time. And then there's physical health status. If somebody has a respiratory problem, you can probably hear, somebody has a stuffed nose when they're speaking. But we can kind of extrapolate that to people have done work on looking at cardiac failure through speech as a signal. And then there are developmental changes, both pubertal changes, which are large, but also changes as we grow up. Our vocal tract starts out at a very tiny level. And then as we are aging, it grows up. So it's, again, another model system from a biological standpoint that it's changing. The brain has to adjust to it and others around have to adjust to it. And that's why I love the speech system still. Okay. But in this case, we wanted to look at machine learning as a way of seeing if we can identify who's the same speaker or not. And there's kind of three broad categories of machine learning. Supervised learning, You need a label, which speaker, with which voice, but now we need to label those things. That's going to require some effort. Unsupervised learning, you don't have any labels and you're doing clustering or other approaches to say which speakers are grouped or which samples grouped together. And then there's the space of self-supervised learning. And that's a space where we've gotten a lot more interested in, where it's like you give variants of the same sound and ask if it's the same kind of person. And that's what we are using, because that doesn't require us to assign labels. We just need discrete categories of sounds. Okay. So these self-supervised models have been actually pretty good in the speech world. They have learned representations that can solve a lot of different tasks around speech pretty well. So we think of it as a powerful tool, but we really don't know what these models are actually encoding. And that's the challenge. We're trying to understand, how do we look at the encoding units of these models and say, we think that this model is encoding this aspect of a voice. How do we make them more interpretable? So we want to turn this black box, which just gives us numbers, into something else. And we're doing this by asking the model to look at kind of different categories of things. We're asking the model to say, can you detect scripted versus spontaneous speech from the same speakers? Could you look at bilingual speech and say these were the same speakers versus different speakers? Can you do speech emotion recognition? As I change my emotion, I'm not changing my identity. If I put in some background noise, I'm still the same speaker, but it's changing the signal context. Are these models capable of doing this? If I shift my pitch, I could talk to you like this for the rest of this talk. It would be very hard for me to do so, but I could. But it's still me. Is it still me? And that's a question that comes up, right? Reverse speech. I can take speech, and I'll give an example of that and the bilingual speech in a second. Can I recognize who the speaker is when I take a speech signal and just transform it the other way around? Filtered speech and more background noise. And we can do it by looking at various kinds of self-supervised models that, at least in the machine learning world, has different ways in which it learns and trains things. And I'm not going to go into the details, but happy to talk about it. So here's one experiment, a forward and reverse speech. So let me play this sound. For some, it may sound like German, but it's not German. And German speaker would have said, that's not German, that's gibberish. So let me play that again. So that's a reverse speech. And here's the corresponding.
Others have tried to explain the phenomena physically.
Okay. Now, how many of you, and I'm just asking this, would have said they are the same people? Okay, they sounded quite similar, they shared characteristics, and that's the question that we're asking with this system. So there's a data set, and I'm going to show this example. This is a very small data set. It's only 5 speakers, but it allows us to illustrate how we're looking at this problem. And then I'll talk about a larger data set with over 1,000 speakers. So can models predict identity from reverse speech? So what we did was we had a classifier, and we kind of trained the model on this forward prediction problem. And then we gave it reverse speech and said, do you identify the same person that you got from it? Okay. Turns out we evaluated this across a whole host of models. And this is 100% accuracy. And most models are doing really, really well. Now, there's a space of fairly classic or very, very powerful speech-related models that came from Facebook that seems to have a variation in how well they do. And I'll talk about that a little bit of time. But overall, the model doesn't care about forward or reverse speech. It can identify, at least in this corpus, the people very, very well. So how do we look at this? So what we said was, okay, there's an embedding, it's a vector. We can take that and reduce the dimension of it. And I think Celine is going to talk about single cell analysis later on, which uses, in her class, which uses some of these same techniques to look at reducing a long vector of things to a much smaller visualization space. So here you can clearly see that different dimensionally reduction algorithms have different effects on how it's reducing the vector. And that's because of the nature of things. But people keep developing new things. These are some of the latest. There's also now TriMap and other things that come into this space of dimensionality reduction. I'm going to take TSNE, which is a little older, not as old as PCA, but has nonlinearities built in, which allows us to couple certain things. And just visibly, I think you can see that there are 10 clusters that show up in the TSNE plot. So somewhere in the representation, there is information about the identities of each of these speakers. But we can do one step better. So what I was plotting there on that original thing was color coding the samples by sex, male, female. So it separates out those. It also gets that identity, which you might have guessed it's actually not mixing up. It could have, right? But I'm just color coding it just to show that it's not mixing up identity. Stimulus type. So this is the forward reverse, and this is where you start seeing some of the variations that I'm looking at. So in some speakers, forward and reverse look highly overlapping. In some others, you start seeing patterns that separate out in that representation. They're still clustered within that speaker, but they start separating out into pieces. If we can do that, we can color this with everything, right, that we know about speech. So we took pitch, and we see that for most part, it shows a gender divide because males to females have a change in pitch from low to high frequency. And that's just a natural biological effect. We can look at intensity, and it doesn't show clear patterns, but it shows, again, trends within clusters that certain aspects of this representation shifts as a function of the amount of energy that the person is expending. MFCC is male frequency capsule coefficient. It's a mouthful, but at the end of the day, it's looking at some aspect of the shape of the vocal tract as a very rough, loose measure. And that seems to show, again, some changes as people are speaking to give a gradient within the cluster. And the final thing we have, which also shows a gradient, is the number of syllables in the sentence. So a syllable is part of a word, and we're seeing. So that's what's wonderful about kind of taking a representation and being able to investigate it with other properties of the signal that allow us to then interpret things a little better than just the 2048 unit vector that the embedding gave us. I'm going to move on to the second experiment, and this is around bilingual speech. Is there a difference? Now, Tyler and his former advisor showed a long time back that people are better off at identifying speakers in their native language. So if I'm a Mandarin speaker as my native language, I will identify speakers, Mandarin speakers, better than if I'm an English speaker identifying a Mandarin speaker versus an English speaker identifying an English speaker. So we asked the model to do this. And sure enough, it was trained on English-speaking voices, and it had a preference for English speakers. It was able to recognize English speakers with greater accuracy. And this also brings up this notion of, does this mean the model is a human? No, absolutely not. But it's showing characteristics of behavior that are similar to human performance. And that's what we're trying to get at with modeling many of these things is, can we get the model to a state where its behavioral performance is similar to a human? I mentioned I'll talk about a couple of these complex models that are out there. So what I'm plotting here is a deep learning model by its layers. And for each layer, I'm taking the representation of that layer and asking how well is that representation capable of identifying the identity of the speaker. So normally you might consider just taking the last layer. It's the end of the model. That's what it's produced. And I would do that. What this is showing is that different models discard information about identity at different points in the model, because it's more advantageous to the model at certain stages to ignore that piece of information, right? If it's trying to do speech recognition and it has extracted out enough content information, doesn't care about who the speaker is. But if we tuned it to do speaker identification as a task, it would train it in different ways. But these Facebook models were focused on kind of getting at speech recognition as a primary criteria for things. And I'll end this section with this part, which is when it comes back to that original question of privacy or individuality, these models are doing pretty darn well. It's not 100%, so we still have some ways to go, but 65% across. So for any of you who have done some machine learning, chance is 1 divided by 1,251. And so it's well above chance. And I would consider this in a fairly large effect size range of being able to get identity of the speaker. But there's variation, but that only means we need more engineering, I think, to push that number higher. So we have to be careful and think about what it means to collect speech. How do we consent around it? How do we do things so that we are protecting individuals, especially as we are looking at speech in the context of various aspects of an individual. So the summary for this section is that the representations capture a lot of information related to identity. The representations appear to capture some speaker-specific gradients related to acoustic cues. We need to kind of scale this out across all kinds of different recording environments. Not all data sets were collected in various diverse environments. Some are collected for particular tasks. They're often collected in a lab. Certain other data sets like Mozilla Common Voice, which is trying to create a speech recognition corpus, collects data. You can go online, search for Mozilla Common Voice and donate your voice to speech recognition. It's a fantastic public data set for multilingual speech recognition. Some models discard aspects of variability to optimize for tasks. So because there's differences in performance across the layers of the model, that tells us that the model is doing certain things to be highly specific to the final goals of the task. And while we're not yet close to 100% accuracy, there are lots of sources of variation. So we have some work to do in identifying where this would completely break the system. But as with your banking app, which looks for your voice, as with the doorbell, which also can look for your voice, there are definitely situations where identity and voice are very closely coupled and can be used as a very one-to-one notion. And this is why the HIPAA law, at least in the US, has a voice print as one of the identifiers in the system. But a voice print is not a voice recording. A voice print is a specific transformation of a voice recording into a vector that identifies people. Not all voices can be turned into a voice print, and that's what part of this investigation space is about. Okay, since I have only a few minutes, I'm going to go through the third thing a little quickly. This is kind of expanding out into the space of communication and mental health. One of the questions was, how did mental health change during the pandemic? I'm sure by now you've heard a lot of stories around it and have read a lot of articles around it. When the pandemic kicked off, it threw Daniel and other students in the program into a space. It's like, okay, what do I do now? How do I do certain things around it? So they were taking a class, and Daniel and 2 other students decided that they were going to work on looking at signatures of changes in mental health on public forums like Reddit. So they were looking at online forums, and then that has led us to kind of thinking about a broader space. Where does information lie in the spectrum from acoustics to linguistics? And in the context of recorded spontaneous things versus conversational systems, which forums are roughly the case. And this is what we're kind of looking at. We're getting at output, and it could be speech features, it could be written text. How do we infer some backward pathway from this? And I've shown you a few things that should tell us, when I played the person who stutters, you could look at it and say this person has stuttering. So there's a lot of information. But could we do this across all of mental health? Could we look at cognitive load as a function of somebody's acoustics? And the answer to almost all of these questions right now is yes. There's already established things in the literature that show that you can detect that depression, Parkinson, cognitive load, auditory damage by analyzing voice characteristics of people. In fact, there's a very nice TED talk from Max Little on Parkinson that's almost a decade old at this point in time, but I would encourage looking at this. Okay. So we take voice, we've seen this. This is an example of separating out UPDRS levels based on voice, which is one measure of Parkinson. It's a noisy measure, but it shows some clear delineations between things. We can look at phoneme durations, how we stretch the phonemes, and relate that to depression level. Different people adjust their speaking rate depending on their depression level. And we can look at how brain activity might correlate with depression levels while speaking. So there are parts of the brain that show changes in signal intensity as a function of depression. When we've looked at the literature, there have been various studies that have lended support for this idea that acoustic features relate to certain types of mental health problems. Now, I would love to use Jerome's new tool to dig more into it or some variants of it. But this is one of the challenges is finding information. You can see the dots. Those are places where we found papers. There's a whole lot of blank space over here. And it's not just detecting depression versus non-depression. What we want voice to be able to do is if it were to be a biomarker to do multi-disorder diagnosis at the same time. We have to be able to do differential detection of these things. And we're not there yet. The other part of this is the fact that when you go to a psychiatrist, you're communicating. And they're communicating in more ways than just the acoustics of voice. Acoustics plays a role, but you're also conveying content. And this is where I would say we have this kind of spectrum all the way from non-speech voice, all the way up to pragmatics, which is in the linguistic space that has to come all together in looking at this mental health space. So here's an example from a Reddit post. This was January of 2019, about 2 months before lockdown started. And this is because information travels, right? Many people here were not, I was still traveling in February. I'm not a big Reddit user, but there were many people on Reddit already talking about this space. And so what these students in the class did, they said was, I'm going to analyze Reddit posts and look at changes in the mental health subreddits as a function of time over the period of the pandemic. And this is, we're talking the early period of the pandemic. So lockdown would have been roughly in the middle of March, and you can see the changes that reflect some of the things happening. So effectively, the text on forums becomes a sensor that can track how people are behaving and doing things. And there were certain indicators, at least in the health anxiety forum, that were significantly earlier. Till another pandemic hits, we won't be able to replicate this, so I can't tell you whether this is a signal or not. And I hope there's not another pandemic anytime soon. But this gave us the opportunity to kind of think about the kinds of topics, terms that go alongside each of these forums as a way of kind of thinking about mental health through these forum lenses. And within these subreddits, you could start seeing changes that semantic characteristics either decreased or increased as a function of time relative to prior years. So assuming that 2018 and 2019 were representative samples that could be compared to, you can look at 2020 and compare it to 2018 and 2019. So we showed that there was no difference in these categories in 2018 and 2019, but relative to that, 2020 started showing differences in these forums. And this has extended to kind of a world of looking at forums for doing causal models and other things that allow us to infer what kinds of interactions affect different kinds of populations. So Daniel is now working on some causal models around suicidal ideation. What kinds of interactions on forums reduce suicidal ideation as time progresses, or changes the dynamics of suicidal ideation? And could that be recovered? And could that be learned and be made helpful for getting moderators or other people to come in and intervene in certain situations? So the acoustic to linguistic spectrum to us is a mental health sensor. We don't understand all the pieces of it, but we know that there's a lot of information across that entire spectrum that we can glean from and use towards differential diagnosis. The public forums as research databases for mental health has many different things. It may depend on the level of precision one is looking for. It's not about an individual per se, although we're trying to see if certain types of things are precise for an individual versus a group or a region. Often these places have zip code-like notions or other things that come with it. And we're doing some of this in collaboration with a company called Rally Point Networks, which is like a LinkedIn for service persons, where the suicide rates are significantly higher. And we're trying to understand if there could be interventions that could kick in earlier on as a result of an NLP on a conversational space. So I've covered kind of three broad areas of projects. They're all run by grad students. So these are all things that can be done in the span of working on things as a grad student life. What I'm going to do I know I'm almost there, but just very quick is a new project that NIH has just funded. It's part of their program on Bridge to AI, which is to generate machine learning data sets. NIH has decided if we are going to do machine learning in biomedicine, we need larger data sets. And we can't do it at single labs collecting some of these data sets. We need to do it at a level that aggregates and makes data accessible to machine learners and AI scientists. So we are part of this effort where Yale and Oliver are the PIs on this project on voice as a biomarker for health. And it brings together ethicists, scientists, bioacousticians, ML engineers, data scientists, and clinicians into a common space. And they're doing this across 4 different types of data generation projects. I'm only going to mention the voice project over here, which involves 10 institutions between US and Canada, kind of helping generate data. Why voice? I hope I don't have to repeat this. Voice is cool, but it also has lots of different kinds of signatures, lots of new technologies. And this, I would say, has transformed the world that it's very easy to collect anywhere. And I know people who may not have a house somewhere, but they seem to have, or a shelter, but they have a phone in their pocket in places around the world, various places. I have hopefully shown us some of these things that changes in voice have been related to certain types of disorders. This is going across mood disorders, respiratory disorders, voice disorders, neurological disorders, and tracking other kinds of things in ICU or hospital-like settings. Because it's a physical model of a system connected to a controller, we can look at this inverse problem and say, where is there information around that we can leverage for doing differential diagnosis? But there are many challenges, which is why this project was funded. Many data sets are small. There's a lot of data sets for speech recognition, but there are very few. If you are going to look at disorders like cardiac failure and say, how many data sets are there around cardiac failure and voice? Those are very small. So the effort here is to kind of increase the set of data that's around it. Lack of diversity in data sets. I mentioned Mozilla Common Voice as a fantastic resource, but the people who use it or could contribute voice to it is generally in the younger demographic age group because it's an open platform. There also is diversity in terms of who can have the time to contribute to some of these data sets. So it's not necessarily representative sample of all the different corners of population that you might want to see in these data sets. So that's a big component of this. And then there's all kinds of technology components that come into play, some of which I've covered. Overall, there's ethics, there's diversity and fairness. There's a lot of standards that have to be built. Things are not necessarily standardized, although there's been a lot of commercial effort in the space. There's infrastructure that also comes up in this context, and then disease categories. Could we say at the end of 2 or 4 years, voice is a terrible biomarker for X? Just ask the person how they're feeling, and that's a much better notion of how things are. So we want to understand these things, and that's what this is funding. So coming back to the speech chain, this is what we started with. it's a wonderful space of interaction, of modeling the system, to look at it from a technological perspective, to look at it from a neurological perspective, to look at it from a societal perspective. And that's what makes this a fun space for us to dig into and understand different pieces of it. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions if there are questions.
I'll keep an eye on the chat to let you know if there are questions that come up in the chat. Maybe you can say that because you're close to the microphone.
Yes, if there are questions in the chat, I'm going to turn off the display so that I can see all of you, but feel free to leave questions in the chat and I'll monitor it.
Yeah, so got a couple of questions. I guess the first one is most of the things that I saw in the voice biometric section, most of the features that were used were frequency domain, right? So like MFCCs or Fourier coefficients, wavelet transforms. Is there any use in more behavioral features, perhaps spaces, how long time is spent between words or word choices or things like that that could augment these models?
Absolutely. So the question, I'll just repeat it for those online. And just get this over here and stop share. Okay, I can see everyone now. The question was about, I mentioned certain things about acoustic features or spectral features that come from voice. Is there any information in the timing of things, whether it's spaces between words or others, that give rise to information? And the answer is yes. In fact, at least in the space of mood disorders, temporal information is one of the things that tends to have an effect that shows changes. I showed a little bit about phonemic durations as relating to levels of depression, but in general, articulation rate or speaking rate changes for certain subgroups of people with certain types of mood disorders. More generally, for things like aphasia, where you would slow down as a result of stroke or injury and build up. So there are temporal things that happen to the system. And this does tie in back with that notion of feed-forward and feedback control systems. If certain aspects of your feed-forward system break down, you are now reliant on the feedback control system to work on things and learn new things. So you tend to slow down and do certain things. The specificity of that still to be investigated, which is why we need larger data pooling. We have a lot of individual indications and smallish samples around it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, there's one other, and I was wondering, which is when you're dealing with data sets like the Mozilla common one you were mentioning, and people pull their data from, how do you deal with discrepancies in sound quality? Because I guess running like a neural network on a condenser microphone captured in a studio is going to be very different from a phone microphone.
Great question. So I'll repeat it again for the online crowd if they couldn't hear it. How do you deal with variations in microphone quality in different environments? So I'll generalize it to not just microphone quality, but environmental noise, right? This room will have different acoustics than a soundproof booth or your home or outside in the park. In fact, one has to think about this in the context of what the goal is of a potential application or investigation. If your goal is to create something that recognizes speech in any context, that variability is good. If your goal is to look at subtle things that requires a certain level of SNR, let's say, then that variability isn't good, and you'll have to filter it down to collections that are then limited by the SNR, the signal to noise ratio of the signal. And that might change the diversity of the data set in these. And that's one of the reasons why this NIH project is important, which is we want to be looking at these disorders. Hence, we are looking at different cues and other things that we might want to collect and think about how that's representative of the population at scale. And so we get data from all corners, at least of the country, if not the world, to represent that in varying levels of SNR.
I have a question about that. Some of the parameters that are going to go into distinguishing voices are a choice, partially a choice anyway, speed, pitch. Others are inherent to the way your vocal cords are formed, etc. So if you take somebody who's trained, voice actors, right, who do all kinds of different voices. Can you distinguish those two kinds of inputs, feature inputs to voice recognition?
So I'll repeat that question. There are volitional changes that people make and changes that are physiological or related. So voice actors can adjust their voice. Emilia Clarke is a fantastic voice actor. If you look up the Mother of Dragons on YouTube and look at all kinds of recordings, you'll find the amazingness with which she changes. There's also a very nice TED Talk by Sarah Jones, she's a voice actor and she brings all the different personalities that comes towards doing this. So in both of these contexts, that ideal representation should say it's the same person. If we are just looking at identity, right? And I think that's Celine's question.
Can you actually distinguish the features that are unique to that person from the ones that are volitional?
And that's where the space expands out at this point in time, why we don't hit 100% recognition. Some of those changes are going to be different enough that puts you much more proximal to somebody else when it comes to voice. And that's what lets us kind of think about the space more than simply writing up and say voice is an identifiable feature and put everything under controlled access form. So one of the questions here is maybe the comparison to genetics versus voice fingerprints. Where on that balance do we lie in terms of identifiability? Both require some kind of database that identifies it with at least a human recognizable thing like a name or address. But how do we match things up? And I would say we're not at that level of a genetic identity, but there's certain circumstances where we can do it. There's a company in Boston called Modulate. They make voice skins. So if you're playing a game and you're interacting with people, you can kind of plug into their framework and they'll transform your voice in real time as you're talking into a different person. Now, from a voice identity perspective, we'll probably be able to recognize certain things because it's not just the changes in shape, but other aspects of temporal dynamics that go into identity processing. And those are not changing, right? It's the same voice, it's just transforming the spectral characteristics of it. But again, a fun video to look at. They always do live demos when they're demonstrating their product. So they'll they do these online interviews where they're connected to a different voice as they're speaking to you.
One last opportunity for questions, and then I think we'll wrap it up. I know it's a little past 1 o'clock. Yeah, over. Yes.
You were looking at the machine learning models across languages. I know that some languages, and I think Mandarin is one of them, the tone that you use for the word can change the meaning of the word. So you kind of have to use one tone. And I was wondering if you thought that would like affect the accuracy of either a person who's listening to that language who's not a native speaker, or if it would have like a noticeable impact on the model performance.
So the question was about whether tonal languages like Mandarin, where the tone, the pitch changes actually play a role in relation to content or what's being said, has an effect on speakers listening for identity when listening to those languages. So I can't explain the reasons for it, but at least those experiments show that indeed there's a language specific effect, right? People who speak Mandarin are able to identify people speaking in Mandarin better than identifying people speaking in English. So there's a linguistic effect that involves, but it could be that their internal models, the thing that maps acoustics to either an average speaker, and the average speaker model is one hypothesis in the space of identity, where you have some representation of an average male and an average female, and then other things are variants off of that representation that play in. And it's a hypothesis. There's been some evidence for it. There are other competing hypotheses as well. So what I couldn't tell you is how it has an effect. I can only say that at least for studies, knowing the language. Now, if they compare two tonal languages, that's a study that I haven't seen, right? You'll have to compare something like Vietnamese and Mandarin and see if native Mandarin speakers can identify Vietnamese easier than, not less easier than native Vietnamese speakers identifying that. I don't know if it has been done.
Sorry, John. I think we should cut it off here. I want to say a very warm and sincere thank you. Was there a question?
There was a question, but I know PJ. I don't know if everybody else wants to listen to that answer, but
I think we'll wrap it up and then you can answer it. We'll leave the Zoom open. You can answer it after. So thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, and looking forward to meeting you again here in Montreal in a little while for some follow-up. Yeah, thank you again.